My daughter-in-law put her hand flat on the dining room table and said, "Eleanor, this house is going to be sold. You don't have to be involved in the details." My son nodded beside her like he always did, slow and certain, the way men nod when they've already decided. My younger son sat at the far end of the table, eyes on his coffee cup. The realtor, they'd brought a woman in a blazer who smelled of hairspray and commission, had spread glossy printouts across the tablecloth my mother had embroidered 40 years ago. I looked at my daughter-in-law. I looked at my son. Then I reached into the canvas bag beside my chair and set a manila envelope on the table, right on top of the property comps. No one spoke. I'd been waiting 11 months for this moment. Not with anger, not with rehearsed speeches, just waiting, the way you wait for a season to finish so the next one can begin. My husband Gerald died on a Tuesday in November, quietly, the way he did most things. We'd been married 39 years. He was a man who said what he meant, and meant what he said. And in those final months, when he knew what was coming, he said one thing to me very clearly. He said, "Don't let them rush you." I promised him I wouldn't. I kept that promise. The house on Weller Street had been ours since 1987. Gerald and I had bought it young and half-broke, with a mortgage that felt like a boulder on our chests for the first 6 years. We painted every room ourselves. I put in the garden. He built the back porch on weekends, 2 boards at a time. Our sons grew up in those rooms, fought over the bathroom, tracked mud through the kitchen, learned to drive in the driveway. When they left for college and then for lives of their own, Gerald and I stayed. We'd earned the quiet. My older son, Michael, moved to Phoenix after he married. He married Diana 12 years ago, and from the first Thanksgiving, I understood the shape of things to come. Diana was a woman who reorganized whatever room she walked into. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets while I was at church. She suggested politely, always politely, that our furniture was dated, that the neighborhood was declining, that Gerald and I might be happier in something smaller and more manageable. What she meant, I understood eventually, was that she would be happier if our assets were liquid and accessible. My younger son, Daniel, was different. He'd stayed in state, worked construction management, called on Sundays. He was not a complicated person. He loved his mother, fixed things when they broke, and didn't ask for much. When Gerald got sick, Daniel drove 4 hours every other weekend.
Any plans to go climbing
Michael
again?
sent a fruit
Anybody
basket and a card signed by his assistant.
literally
Gerald knew
the
his
day my
sons.
physical
He'd
therapist
watched them for
tells me I'm
decades,
allowed
with
to
the
climb
quiet attention of a
and
man
go
who said
climbing.
little but understood plenty.
Literally
The last
the
year of
day-
his life, he
the
spent
day
considerable
she tells
time
me
with our estate attorney, a careful woman named Miss Pratt, whose office smelled of old coffee and good intentions. I knew he was updating documents. I knew the general shape of what he was doing. What I didn't know, until Miss Pratt called me 6 weeks after the funeral, was the full detail. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance proceeds, all of it had been placed into a revocable living trust. With me as sole trustee, Gerald had done it quietly, thoroughly, and without telling Michael. He'd told Daniel, because Daniel had asked once what the plan was, and Gerald respected a direct question. He'd told me enough to understand I was protected. He had not told Michael because he already knew what Michael would say, and he saw no reason to have that argument before it was necessary. It became necessary the February after Gerald died. Michael called on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual. He and Diana typically communicated through a shared calendar invite, brief and logistical. This call was something else. He said he and Diana had been talking. He said the house was too big for me alone. He said the market was strong right now, Mom, really strong, and it didn't make sense to let that equity just sit there. He said he'd been speaking with a financial advisor, Diana's cousin, as it happened, who thought a structured sale with proceeds split into trusts for the boys would be the most tax-efficient approach. I said I'd think about it. He called the following Wednesday, and the one after that. Each call the same, just slightly more urgent. Diana started texting me articles about downsizing, about senior communities with swimming pools and organized activities, about how the happiest retirees were the ones who simplified. I read every article. I did not respond to any of them. Then came the Sunday in March when they showed up at the door with the realtor. I'd seen the car in the driveway from the bedroom window. Diana's silver SUV, Michael's dark sedan behind it, and a third car I didn't recognize. I'd put on my good cardigan. I'd taken the manila envelope from my filing cabinet, the one Miss Pratt had given me, and I'd put it in my canvas bag. Then I'd gone downstairs and made a pot of coffee. Because whatever was about to happen, I was going to be calm. Daniel was there too. They'd called him, I found out later, and told him it was a family conversation about finances. He'd driven down that morning. He was already at the table when I came in from the kitchen, and his expression when he saw the realtor told me everything. He hadn't known she was coming. The realtor's name was Heather. She had a laminated folder and a practiced smile, and she launched immediately into a presentation about comparable sales in the neighborhood, average days on market, projected listing price. Diana leaned forward, engaged, asking questions. Michael nodded at every answer. Daniel stared at the table. I let it go on for a few minutes. I poured coffee. I set out the creamer. I sat down in my chair at the head of the table, the chair Gerald always said was mine because I was the one who kept the house running, and I waited for a pause. When Heather stopped to flip to a new page, I set the envelope on top of her printouts. Heather looked at it. Diana looked at it. Michael's nod stopped midway. This house is held in the Gerald and Eleanor Whitmore Living Trust, I said. I am the sole trustee. No sale, no listing, no transfer of any kind can occur without my written authorization. I looked at Michael. I wanted to be clear about that before we went any further. The silence that followed had weight to it. Diana was the first to recover. She said, with that same polished calm she always used, Eleanor, we're just trying to help you plan. I said I knew that. I said I appreciated the thought. I also said I was not planning to sell, not this year, and not based on a conversation I hadn't been invited to have. Michael said there must be some confusion about how the trust worked. I said there wasn't. I said Miss Pratt had been very thorough. Heather closed her laminated folder. She excused herself about 20 minutes later, saying she had another appointment. She left before the coffee was finished. What happened in the room after she left was quieter and harder. Michael's politeness fell away the way a jacket comes off in a warm room. He said I was being unreasonable. He said he and Diana had been planning around this, that there were financial considerations I didn't understand. I asked him what considerations. He said it was complicated. I said I had time. He didn't have an answer for that. What he had was frustration, and underneath it, something older, something I recognized from when he was a teenager, and the world didn't arrange itself to his schedule. He looked at me like I was an obstacle, and I understood then, clearly and without grief, that he had been looking at me serve that way for years. I'd simply been too kind to see it. Daniel spoke up once. He said, Michael, maybe we should just let Mom think about what she wants. Michael said Daniel didn't understand the financial picture. Daniel said maybe Michael didn't understand whose house it was. They drove home separately that afternoon. I stood at the kitchen window after everyone left and watched the dogwood in the backyard, the one I'd planted the year Daniel started kindergarten. Gerald used to sit beneath it in the evenings in July. I could still see the outline of where the grass had worn down from his chair. I wasn't sad. I was awake. I called Miss Pratt the next morning and told her what had happened. She said the trust was solid. She said Michael could consult his own attorney if he wanted to, but that the documents were clear and properly filed, and there was nothing to contest. She asked if I wanted to add any additional protections. I said yes. I wanted everything in writing, every conversation documented, every verbal pressure noted. Miss Pratt said I was smart to do that. She said she'd seen situations like this go further than a Sunday afternoon argument. She was right. It went further. 3 weeks later, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Phoenix. It was addressed to me personally, formal and polite in the way that expensive letters are polite, which is to say, not polite at all. It requested a meeting to discuss the administration of the Gerald Whitmore estate and ensure equitable outcomes for all beneficiaries. It used the word equitable twice. It did not mention the trust by name, which told me Michael's attorney hadn't read the documents carefully yet, or hadn't been given them. I forwarded the letter to Miss Pratt without calling Michael first. He'd made his choice about how this would go. I spent that evening in the living room with a glass of tea and Gerald's old reading chair pulled close to the lamp. The house was quiet in the way it had been since November, a quiet I was still learning to inhabit. I thought about the early years, when Michael was small and earnest and used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from church. I thought about the summer he was 14 and built a birdhouse with Gerald in the garage, badly, with nails going crooked, but proud of it anyway. There had been a person in him worth reaching toward. I didn't know when that had changed. I suspected it hadn't happened all at once, but gradually, in small replacements, comfort for curiosity, entitlement for effort. Diana hadn't caused it. She'd found it already there. Daniel called that Thursday. He'd gotten a call from Michael's attorney, too, asking for his cooperation in a family resolution process. Daniel said he'd told them he wasn't interested in cooperating with anything that went against his mother's wishes. I asked him if Michael had said anything to him directly. He said yes. Michael had said he was being naive, that I was making emotional decisions and someone needed to look out for the family's financial interest. Daniel said. He actually used the word naive, Ma. I said, I know. There was a pause. Then Daniel said, tell me what you need from me. I said, just don't sign anything. He said he wouldn't. I hadn't always appreciated Daniel the way I should have. He was the quieter son, the one who didn't fill a room the way Michael did. Gerald always said Daniel was the one who did the work while Michael announced it. I'd thought that was a little unfair. Now, I wasn't sure it was. A month after the letter, I went to Miss Pratt's office and made changes. Not to the trust. The trust was exactly what Gerald had intended, and I wasn't going to alter his intentions. But to my own will, the document that governed what would happen after I was gone. I'd been putting off updating it since the funeral. Too tired. Too grieving. Now I sat across from Miss Pratt with a notepad and a clear head, and we worked through it methodically. I told her I wanted Daniel to receive the house. Not sold, not liquidated the house itself, on the condition that he maintain it for at least 5 years. I told her I wanted a no-contest clause, specific and binding. Anyone who challenged the will would forfeit their inheritance entirely. Miss Pratt wrote it all down without expression. I also told her I wanted to amend the trust to include my niece, Ruthie. Ruthie was my younger sister's daughter. She was 31. Worked as a physical therapist, lived in the next town over. She'd started coming around after Gerald died, first with casseroles, then just to sit with me. She never asked about the house or the estate or what my plans were. She asked if I was sleeping. She asked if I'd been to the doctor recently. She brought her dog, a ridiculous spaniel named Fig, because she said animals helped, and she was right. Ruthie reminded me of myself before I learned to make myself smaller in rooms where men were deciding things. I set aside a portion of the investment accounts for her. Not the bulk, most of that would go to Daniel and to a literacy organization Gerald had supported for 20 years, but enough. Enough to let her buy the practice she'd been building toward, the one she'd mentioned once, quickly, like mentioning a dream you're afraid to have out loud. I didn't tell her. I just did it. Miss Pratt looked up from her notes when I finished. She said, "You've thought this through." I said, "I had a good teacher." I meant Gerald, but I also meant myself. The response to Michael's attorney came from Miss Pratt, not from me. It was 2 pages.
Hold on.
and it
Let me
included a
double-check.
complete copy of the trust documents, the filing date, the certification number,
Not
and a
amiss.
politely devastating
Just,
paragraph explaining that the trust predated any discussion of sale and that my authority as trustee was absolute and legally unambiguous. The letter ended by noting that any further legal action would be defended vigorously and that the associated costs would be borne by the initiating party. Michael didn't call after that letter.
Make a new folder.
Not for 3 weeks.
Called-
When he did call, it was late on a Saturday night, which meant Diana wasn't in the room. His voice was different, lower, without the professional smoothness he'd developed over years of sales and negotiation. He said he understood now why I'd been so calm at the table. I said I wasn't calm because I was hiding something. I was calm because your father made sure I didn't have to be afraid. There was a long silence. Then he said, I didn't know he'd done all that. I said, he didn't tell you because he knew you'd argue with him. Michael didn't respond to that. I said, your father loved you, but he loved me first. And he knew the difference between providing for his children and handing them his wife's security. More silence. Then, he said, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was maybe 12 years old and had broken something in the garage and had come to confess. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't rush to accept it. I held it for a moment and examined it. The way you examine something you want, very much, to be real. I said, I hear that. I didn't say more. Not yet. An apology, spoken in the dark on a Saturday night, is a beginning, not a resolution. I'd learned the difference. He didn't contest the estate. His attorney withdrew the inquiry 6 days later. I don't know what conversation happened between him and Diana. I don't know if it was her idea to push or his, and I'd stopped trying to assign that geometry. What I knew was that the pressure had stopped, and the house was still mine, and the spring was coming. The morning after the attorney withdrawal notification arrived, I went out to the backyard before coffee. The dogwood was just beginning to bud, pale and provisional. I stood there in Gerald's old canvas jacket, the one that still smelled like cedar and machine oil, and I thought about the 39 years we'd put into this ground. Every argument we'd had in this yard, and every apology, every 4th of July, every snow we'd shoveled together and complained about together, and then made soup afterward because there was nothing better after cold work than something warm. I wasn't done with this place. I had years left in me, and I intended to spend them here, in this specific quiet, surrounded by the life we'd built. Ruthie came by that Friday the way she always did, Fig trotting ahead of her up the porch steps. She had coffee in a thermos and a paper bag of those cheese danishes I'd mentioned once and never expected her to remember. She remembered everything, Ruthie did. Not the big things especially, but the small ones, the ones that told you a person had actually been listening. We sat on the porch in the early spring chill, coats on, coffee steaming. Fig settled at my feet like he'd always lived there. I told her about the letter from the attorney, the withdrawal. I told her the house was secure. I told her Miss Pratt had everything in order. Ruthie said, Uncle Gerald would have loved this. He always said you were the one holding everything together. I said, he held a great deal himself. She nodded, looking out at the yard. Then she said, Are you okay? Not legally. Actually, okay. I thought about it honestly. I said, I'm better than okay. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Just once. Just briefly. Fig thumped his tail. There's a thing that happens when you stop shrinking. It doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one morning transformed. It happens quietly, like the yard coming back in April gradually, without drama, until one day you notice the green is just there, steady and full, and you can't remember exactly when it arrived. I had spent years in the habit of making my needs small enough to fit through doors without causing trouble. I had signed documents I should have read. I had nodded in rooms where I should have spoken. I had mistaken keeping peace for keeping myself. And they were not the same thing. Gerald had seen it before I did. He'd been protecting me before I knew I needed it, filling in the gaps my own silence had left. That was love, not the kind in greeting cards, but the kind that does the actual work, that sits with an attorney on a Tuesday afternoon and makes sure the person you love most is not left standing outside a door. I would not waste what he'd built. Daniel came the following weekend to fix the gutter on the north side of the house, the one that had been pulling away from the fascia since October. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up Saturday morning with his truck and his tool belt and a coffee from the gas station down the road. I watched him from the kitchen window for a while before going out. He didn't say much while he worked. That was fine. I handed him screws when he needed them and held the ladder when he asked. When he was done, we sat on the back porch, and he told me about a project he was managing in the spring. Something commercial, a renovation downtown. He was proud of it. I could hear it in how he described the problem with the existing foundation and how his crew was going to solve it. I thought about how little I'd asked him about his work over the years, how much space I'd given Michael's achievements, and how little I'd made for Daniel's quieter ones. That was something I intended to correct. I told him about the will. Not all of it, but enough. I told him the house was going to be his someday, if he wanted it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You sure?" I said, "I'm very sure." He looked at the yard, at the gutter he'd just fixed, at the garden beds still brown from winter. He said, "I always liked this house." I said, "I know. That's why." He nodded slowly, the way his father used to nod when something settled right. Fig had wandered around from the front and was nosing at the garden edge. Daniel reached down and scratched him between the ears. We didn't talk about Michael. We didn't need to. There are things you can address and things you simply outlast, and eventually you learn to know the difference. Michael sent a text in April, brief, practical, asking if I needed any help with the spring yard work. I replied that Daniel had already been by. There was a pause of about an hour. Then he sent back, "Okay, let me know if you need anything." I said I would. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was a crack in a wall, and I was willing to see what might grow through it. Diana did not reach out. I didn't expect her to, and I held no particular feeling about it. She had made calculations about my life that hadn't accounted for who I actually was. That was her limitation, not mine. In May, I started a new section of the garden. Gerald had always wanted a cutting garden along the back fence, the kind you grew specifically to bring inside, dahlias, zinnias, larkspur. He'd mentioned it casually every summer for years, and we'd never gotten around to it. I was getting around to it now. Ruthie helped me dig the beds one Saturday. Her hands were stronger than you'd expect, physical therapist's hands. Fig supervised from the shade. We worked most of the afternoon, talking about her practice, about a patient she was particularly proud of, about the building she was hoping to lease eventually. I listened to her the way she always listened to me, like it mattered, like there was no other conversation I'd rather be having. Near the end of the afternoon, when we were washing our hands at the outdoor spigot, she said, "Thank you for letting me come here. I know it sounds strange, but this house feels like I don't know. It feels like somewhere I'm supposed to be." I dried my hands. I looked at her, this young woman with dirt under her fingernails and her hair falling out of its braid, and I thought of everything I'd set in motion with Miss Pratt, the document in the filing cabinet with her name on it. The future she didn't know yet was already partly secured. I said, "It's not strange at all. She'd find out eventually, when the time came. For now, she was here, and the dahlias were going in the ground, and the evening was warm, and that was enough." Gerald used to say that most of what made a life good was not the large events but the sustained ones, the habits of decency, the people you kept coming back to, the small choices you made quietly without audience or applause. He said it better than I'm saying it now. He had a way with that kind of thing. I think about it when I sit on the porch in the evenings, his canvas jacket around my shoulders, the cutting garden coming in, the house behind me holding its own weight the way good houses do. There were people who thought I was a woman waiting to be managed, who looked at me in my kitchen with my embroidered tablecloth and my good cardigan and saw only the soft edges of an old grief, something to be guided and handled and redirected toward their convenience. They had not been paying attention. Grief is not passivity. Loss is not confusion. And a woman who has spent 39 years building something alongside someone she loved is not, when it comes to the point, going to hand it over because someone arrived with a Realtor and a laminated folder. I will tell you what I told Miss Pratt the morning after that Sunday in March, when I sat across from her desk and we began to make everything clean and clear and permanent. She asked what my primary goal was. I said, to finish things the right way, not to punish anyone, not to win. To finish with the same integrity with which we began. She asked if I had everything I needed. I thought about the manila envelope, the trust, the house on Weller Street with its imperfect gutter and its dogwood and its worn-down patch of grass where Gerald used to sit in July. I thought about Daniel and his truck in the driveway, about Ruthie and her dog and her cheese danishes and her hands that actually held on. I said, yes, I had everything I needed. I just had to stop pretending I didn't. If any part of this felt familiar, if you've ever sat at a table and watched someone rearrange your life without asking, I want you to know something. It is not too late to set the envelope down. It is not too late to say, calmly and without apology, that this is yours, and you know exactly what it is, and no, you will not be handing it to anyone for safekeeping. You have already done the work. You don't need permission to protect what it earned you. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Tell me what it brought up. I read every one. And if you know someone sitting at a table right now, unsure of their own ground, send this to them. Let it be the thing that reminds them they're not alone. And more importantly, that they were never as powerless as someone made them believe.